And our opening words this morning are by L. Annie Forster. The ringing of the bell calls us to worship. The pounding of a drum calls us to war. The popping of a cork calls us to celebration. What is the sound that calls us to hear one another? Listen. Listen carefully. It is here in the silence. Listen deeply. The beating of our own hearts calls us to ourselves, calls us to be our true selves, calls us to be our best selves, calls us to be what we might become. Listen, there is another sound. The breath of our neighbors calls us outside ourselves, calls us to be companions, calls us to be allies, calls us to be partners. Listen, we must heed the call of our own hearts, where love and truth, care and justice are born. Last week, we lit a candle for Trayvon Martin's family, and since then we've been processing our emotions after the not guilty verdict and processing the national conversation that it has sparked. So this morning, I offer this prayer written by my colleague, Meg Riley. Let us join together in the spirit of prayer. Spirit of love and justice, I am angry. May my anger burn cleanly, joining the light of so many hearts on fire. May we know anger as a source of strength, anger that seeks to purify, anger that has as its fuel the power of truth, anger grounded in love. May I live my life so that Trayvon Martin did not die in vain. May my anger give me strength to take action, to stand my own ground, the ground of compassion, the ground of justice which dwells beyond courts of law and its technicalities, the ground of worth and dignity for every human being. May we live our lives so that Trayvon Martin did not die in vain, so that African American youth are not seen as threatening merely because they exist. May we take steps to bring such a world into vision, concrete steps, particular steps in our own communities. Anger used well is energy for life. Anger turned inward saps the strength. Anger turned to rage severs real connection. May I use this holy anger well. Use my privilege well. Use my voice and my strength and my power. May we draw on the strength of those who have turned anger to love through the generations. Those who have made a way out of no way. Those who have been burned but not consumed by this holy fire. May we remember the strength of our connections to the generations, the ancestors, and those yet to be born. The strength of our connection to the fighters and the lovers. May I live my life so that Trayvon Martin did not die in vain. May we live our lives so that he did not die in vain. May he live forever in our deeds, in our commitment to justice, a justice which can never be found in any court of law. Amen. Our reading this morning is by Elizabeth Tarbox, called The Teaching Bean. When I was a child, my stepmother gave me and my sister each a lima bean. She showed us how to dampen some blotting paper and line a jam jar with it, and how to place the bean carefully between the blotting paper and the jar. She told us to stand the jars on the windowsill in our bedroom and keep the blotting paper wet and watch to see what would happen. A little later, I took my bean out and polished it up with a little bit of furniture polish. It was all shiny now and smelled much better than my sister's bean. In a few days, my sister's bean swelled and a strong white root pushed out of the bottom of the bean. My bean just sat there. A week later, my sister's bean sprouted a green shoot that forced its way up and out of the top of the jar. My bean did nothing, but began to look wrinkly. In another week, my sister's jar was full of roots and shoots, and the bean was ready to be planted. My bean shriveled up and fell to the bottom of the jar, and I threw it away. How often have I covered things with furniture polish to make them shiny, to make them smell better? How often in my life have I cared more about the way things looked and how they smelled rather than how they really were? I spent half a lifetime covering my feelings with the emotional equivalent of furniture polish, thinking that if I looked good and smelled good, the ache inside would go away. But spirits are not like beans, thank God. They may shrivel with neglect, but as long as life persists, there is the chance to wash off the polish and redeem the growing thing inside. Here's a conversation that I had with my nephew when he was just 3 years old. We were sitting at the dining room table when he turned to me and said, "Do you know what happened to my dream?" "What happened?" I asked. "It broke," he said. I was astounded. "How did it break?" I asked. He shrugged. "It was fragile," he said. Do you remember that? You were really little. It was fragile. How many of our dreams, like my nephew's, are fragile? How many of our dreams break because they cannot stand up to the pressure of everyday life? I can think of at least one that doesn't hold up against reality well. The dream of being perfect. The dream of always having a shiny bean that looks and smells good. So why do so many of us hold on to such a fragile dream? Maybe it is because in our Western culture we are constantly being presented with images reflecting this fragile dream. Images held up as the standard bearers in our lives. Airbrushed models and fancy new cars. Women on TV who clean their homes with big smiles on their faces. And men who never cry. Have any of you ever thumbed through the magazine Real Simple? I've been interested in simplicity for a while now, and even joined a simplicity circle one year. So I was excited to see a magazine dedicated to the simple life. I was pretty disappointed. Diametrically opposed to all of the non-consumerism that I was striving for was page after page, spread after spread of perfect people living perfect lives in perfect houses with perfectly matching pillows. One gorgeous couple I read about in this magazine had quit their jobs and moved to a house on a lavender farm, which they styled after an English country cottage. And this, the perfectly situated and decorated and coordinated lavender farm, is being lifted up as the model of a simple life. I'll admit, a lavender farm sounds wonderful, but how attainable is it? And to who? Why isn't there a feature article in Real Simple on wearing your pants twice before washing them? That's simple, and everyone can do it. It's not perfect, though. Perfect people probably wash their pants every time, don't they? No, we are supposed to be not simple, but simply perfect. We are supposed to be thin, agreeable, happy, beautiful people who always get back to every email within the hour. Even the Protestant theology that some of us grew up with holds up the idea of perfecting ourselves as a way of getting closer to God. In this view, God is perfect also. But does that need to be our belief still? Does that need to be our dream for ourselves, fragile as it is? I understand the pressure to be perfect. It's very real. The women, especially in my family, struggle mightily with perfectionism. My mother introduces herself as a recovering perfectionist, and her friends tease her that she is not really there yet. My sister, too, has historically had this tendency toward perfection. Once, when she was at my house and we were working on a scrapbook for my mother's birthday gift, my sister turned to me and asked where I kept my T-square. My what? But she was serious. In her mind, a T-square was an essential tool of her precise and well-aligned aesthetic. Somehow, though, it has just never made it onto my list of possessions. We were forced to do without. But also in my family is the model of my grandmother on my father's side, whose highest praise is not, it's perfect, but rather, it's good enough. This was her response to us, no matter what we brought her attention to. Good grades, a watercolor picture we had painted, a life plan. If it was positive, it was good enough. It used to infuriate me. I wanted to hear, I dreamed of hearing, it's perfect. So I, for one, could really use a magazine or a theology even, whose message is that perfection is not the highest aim. Even my extremely precise sister has begun to see that there is a better message and a healthier dream to have. Maybe it's having little kids or surviving cancer, but her sights are now set not on perfection, but what is life-giving and what is good enough. A few years ago, I took my sister to Chelsea, where my friend Kat was working as a community organizer. Kat was trying to revive a community garden there, and I sort of offered my sister's skills as a landscape architect, thinking the two might connect over this exciting project. No one else in Kat's office was very enthusiastic about the garden project. Faced with the poverty, violence, and cultural barriers between neighbors that they were working to assuage, why bother with this patch of overgrown dirt nestled amidst the rusty skeletons of industrial buildings? In Kat's eyes, though, as in mine, a garden is not just a patch of earth. It is hope. And Kat had a lot of hope in that garden, which she dreamed of transforming that spring into something beautiful that would bring the community together. But it was a big project, enormous. I watched as my precise sister became Kat's mentor in simplicity. Why refurbish the whole garden, an overwhelming task without much help, when half the garden could more easily be transformed? Save the other half for when more people get excited. Why buy new lumber to replace the rotting, chemically treated railroad ties holding together the beds when the limited money available was needed just to cart the unhealthy wood away? People have been gardening in mounds of dirt for centuries. The roots of the newly planted beds would be protection enough from erosion. And were mulched walkways a necessity? No. The trampling of feet would do to maintain the pathways for now. I watched as Kat's dream of the perfect garden, a fragile dream in danger of breaking because of lack of support and resources, transformed into a more hardy dream of a good beginning for this garden. A dream that could be sustained and grown over time, but one that would not break under the pressure of perfect. I stood by speechless as my sister told Kat, "Believe me, I understand about overachieving, but it's not always helpful. Sometimes it gets in the way of taking the next step. Just bite off what you can chew. You can do more later. It'll be okay." "I think I need someone to tell me that every day," said Kat. There are cultures in which perfection is not the ultimate aim. The Navajo rug weavers, for example, have a tradition of always weaving a flaw into the corner of each rug. It's a reminder that as humans, we are not perfect, and it's where the spirit moves in and out of the rug. Perfection, says Richard Rohr, is not the elimination of imperfection. That's our Western either-or need-to-control thinking. Perfection, rather, is the ability to incorporate imperfection. And in Japan, too, there is the idea of wabi-sabi, the beauty of the imperfect. Robin Griggs Lawrence writes, "According to Japanese legend, a young man named Seno Rikyu sought to learn the elaborate set of customs known as the Way of Tea. He went to tea master Takinju, who tested the younger man by asking him to tend the garden. Seno Rikyu cleaned up debris and raked the ground until it was perfect, then scrutinized the immaculate garden. Before presenting his work to the master, he shook a cherry tree, causing a few blossoms to spill randomly onto the ground. Wabi-sabi, the beauty of the imperfect. Rugs with a bit of color out of place, fallen cherry blossoms on an immaculately cleared ground. Half a community garden, tended with care and full of promise. Friends sharing real emotions and not just the shiny ones. I like this beauty so much better than the beauty of perfect. I wonder what we can do to make this our dream instead of holding on to that fragile one. Just to clarify, I'm not saying we should be lazy. I'm not saying we should accept all our faults and cease to work toward being better people, cease to work toward justice. But there are some impossible standards that we're holding ourselves to that only serve to make us feel bad about ourselves. Dreams that could be set aside for sturdier ones that help us to be less pretend and more ourselves. I'm suggesting that perhaps sometimes we are better people because we are not perfect. Remember that the teaching bean, all polished and nice, shriveled and died. Our spiritual journey is not toward perfection, but toward what is life-giving. We have each been given a bean, and it's ourselves. We can polish it up, make ourselves shiny and nice from the outside, but how much more life-giving would it be to water ourselves so that we may open, that we may grow? We won't be safe inside our shiny, polished coats, but we will be pushing our way out of the stifling expectation of perfection, unfurling in the warmth of acceptance, and growing into beanstalks. Was this what we dreamed of? Not exactly, but it's good enough. And I'm starting to see the value in that. Amen, and blessed be.